This is Invested in Climate with Jason Rissman. I see climate as the world's biggest, most diverse, most important movement in human history. Millions of people dedicate themselves every day to protecting the planet. This podcast shares conversations with advocates, entrepreneurs, investors, policy experts, and anyone else that can push our thinking about what's possible and what needs to happen to address climate change. If you have ideas for episodes or feedback, get in touch on LinkedIn. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. I'm currently building a new venture. It's related to storytelling and how we engage all sorts of folks in meaningful climate action. If you have expertise in this area, big ideas, or examples of something that's really working, get in touch. Thanks for listening and for doing whatever it is you're doing to support climate progress. Okay, let's get started.
I've spent a lot of time privately with CEOs and senior executives, sourcing executives at these companies. They all believe in their need to essentially line up with climate change goals. And they think that ultimately they will be regulated in a way that they will need to hit it. I think where we are now is it is still tough. Every large company is putting out too much stuff.
Hi, folks. The apparel industry has a massive impact on the environment. The industry is the second highest consumer of water, and it drives almost 10% of global carbon emissions. And despite thousands of smart people working to make this industry cleaner and all sorts of investments by brands, emissions are actually still increasing. To learn about this problem and get an inside look at the efforts to address it, I caught up with two old friends, Jason Kibbey and Evan Wiener. Jason was the founder of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and more recently, a technology company called Worldly that helps businesses track their supply chains. Evan is a sustainability expert at McKinsey & Company, who previously worked at Nike and H&M. These guys know the fashion industry inside and out. We talked about the state of sustainability in the apparel industry, the challenges of competitive and pricing pressures, the role of legislation, the opportunity for startups, the questionable authenticity of corporate sustainability aspirations, what needs to change, and much more. This is an industry that simply needs to change dramatically, and I learned a lot about how we might get there. Let's go. Jason and Evan, welcome to Invested in Climate. So great to have you both here today.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Great to be here.
Well, it's great to reconnect with both of you. We go way back, and I'm excited for this conversation and to catch up. You guys offer different perspectives on the state of sustainability in the apparel industry, sort of an inside-out and an outside-in duo. Let's start by hearing about your backgrounds, which will explain this inside-out, outside-in pairing thing I'm referring to. Evan, let's start with you. You're the inside-out guy. Tell us about your background.
Yeah, well, I've worked now in the fashion apparel footwear industry for over 20 years. And as you say, from pretty much inside, for most of that time, inside large retail brands like Adidas, H&M, Nike. I started in the industry right after college. I was a Division I athlete, and I decided that if I couldn't play sports, I wanted to work in them. So I got an internship with Adidas, and I spent 10 years there really learning how to work within and navigate a large retail brand. I learned things like how complex the supply chain is, how difficult it is to compete or navigate with competing priorities. And overall, in that span of time, I got to see a brand, arguably two of the most powerful, influential functions, which are marketing and product in the categories. From that experience, I just see, and I still do today, how influential brands are in our daily life as consumers, but of course, within their very complex, fragmented, diverse supply chains. And because of this, I became interested in the idea of what if a brand could serve a higher purpose beyond just the products it sells? What if it could use that purpose to drive growth? And that was really my entry point into sustainability back in 2011. But I also decided that purpose, that was just one aspect of it. Sustainability is really complex, touches every aspect of the value chain. And if I wanted to be a sustainability leader, I needed to become a better expert in sustainability and also have a broader cross-functional understanding of the industry. So I left Adidas, went back to business school. It's where Jason and I met for the first time. And I was really inspired by sustainability leaders working in the consumer sector at the time. Paul Pullman, Jochen Seitz, Hannah Jones. even Bill McDonough. These were leaders that were looking at sustainability not through the lens of risk or compliance, but as innovation and growth. And that's the vision that has motivated me for the past 12 years working now in sustainability, to help brands drive sustainability as a source of competitive advantage, essentially, and as a source of growth and innovation.
Fantastic. Evan, I didn't know about your past as an athlete. What sport did you play? We'll see if we can work in some sports references.
I played soccer. It feels like a long time ago.
Right. Jason, over to you. Tell us briefly about your role you've been playing in sustainable fashion.
I started in sustainable fashion. Actually, I worked at Patagonia as an intern developing one of their environmental campaigns back in 2007. So a little while back now. After that, and in business school at Berkeley, where all of us have a Berkeley connection in one way or another, I ended up starting a sustainable then underwear company called Packed Apparel. Now it's a sustainable basics company. And I got excited in looking at entrepreneurship and apparel and sustainability because I saw fashion as the intersection of our values, our aspirations, and really messy supply chains. And so it's where these things really come together in an exciting and different way. It made me think that there was going to be interesting work in this space and there was going to be change in this space. And other places like food had sort of, gotten a little stale and focused on organics and hadn't really moved beyond that. And I thought fashion was going to be some place where innovation and excitement and change was going to happen. When I sold Packed Apparel, I ended up running the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, where we developed the Higg Index, did that for several years, and then spun a technology company then called HigCo, now called Worldly, out of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And Worldly now collects data for a very large percentage of the worldwide apparel and footwear value chain. And now I'm actually in the privileged position of taking a little bit of time off after leading Worldly and really taking an outside perspective and enjoying some time living in Europe.
You guys also both share in common being Americans that are now living in Europe. And I'm not sure if that was intentional as a way to get closer to the apparel and fashion industry or just total lifestyle choice. Was this a strategic move?
For me, it was. We actually moved when I was transitioning out of the leadership of Worldly. There was so much more happening here in terms of legislation, broad awareness amongst the companies. And I would say that Europe is in many ways ground zero for the brand side of sustainability. Asia is certainly that for the supply chain. And there's just so much happening here that's, I think, really moving the needle worldwide.
Yeah, for me too. I mean, I had personal reasons and job reasons, but there are more opportunities for sustainability professionals in Europe. And there are brands, arguably, that are pushing harder. And so I got the opportunity to lead circularity for H&M in 2021. So we took that opportunity to move our family over here. And my current role is senior advisor to McKinsey. A lot of the clients we work with are global in their reach, but are headquartered in Europe.
Right. Well, thanks for setting the stage. Let's dive in and begin by hearing what's at stake. Tell us a bit about the environmental and societal impact of the apparel industry that folks like both of you have been working to address.
Sure. I think, Jason, when you're looking at this, or when we look at it from an industry perspective, and I'll talk also through the lens of how a brand looks at it, but you look at the all impact areas across the environmental spectrum. So generally that falls into 5-6 buckets: the carbon impact, the waste impact, water, chemistry, and biodiversity. So across that whole spectrum of environmental impact of the industry, it's pretty broad and it's pretty deep. If you look at probably the pinnacle of what brands use as a metric for their sustainability impact, it is carbon. And as an industry, the fashion, apparel, footwear industry accounts for 3 to 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it is pretty high, and it also is pretty broad. The exact number is really, really hard to nail down. And as we get better data, that number will improve. On the waste side, I'll highlight one other, but waste is a big area of focus in the industry. Some stats I was looking at earlier today, the reality is most clothes, apparel, textiles people buy don't get recycled. In fact, it's less than 1% of all apparel gets recycled into new apparel or some new textile. And I always put the business angle on that. That translates to $100 billion in material that is just wasted essentially every year. So there's a lot of carbon impact, there's a lot of waste, and then of course, across the other areas, water, chemistry, and biodiversity, the numbers are equally large and challenging to address.
Thanks, Evan.
I might add a little bit to that as well. There is, of course, a very large worker impact, which I think it could be its own show to talk about that. And additionally, when you look at the disaggregated value chain of fashion products, this has been an industry that has been figuring out how to spread out production really for several hundred years at this point. And with spreading out production tends to mean that problems go unseen and unaccounted for. And those negative, sorry to use a technical word, but those negative externalities that nobody is responsible for, that nobody's accounting for, those are really the root of the problem of this global, decentralized, disaggregated value chain that has been essentially shedding responsibility for its impact for several hundred years.
Thanks, Jason. So we heard earlier that both of you have been focusing on this problem now for many years, and across the apparel space, pretty much all of the brands have sustainability teams. There's all sorts of consultancies and all sorts of organizations that are helping with this problem. There's a lot of people working to improve how apparel and fashion show up in terms of sustainability impact. How are we doing? How would you characterize where we're at in this global effort to make fashion and apparel more sustainable?
I think Evan wrote the report on this, so he should start.
Well, there's bright spots and there's challenges. And it's really important to look at both because there's no one right answer. You can look at it through the challenges lens and you can look at the progress. And so we'll highlight a few of those. In terms of some bright spots where we are, there is great progress and momentum with policy and legislation, right? Some things that are just unraveling right now, which are really important. We can talk about some of the legislation. I've spent a lot of time and space within brands looking at the consumer demand side, the commercial value of sustainability, even, for example, the value from a talent acquisition retention for brands to attract and retain talent. These are all showing really positive signs and some bright spots where sustainability is within the industry. A third area that I think is a good bright spot that we're seeing progress on is a lot of brands are setting science-based targets. We did some research at McKinsey showing that 2/3 to 3/4 of brands have set science-based targets. So that's a huge, huge milestone progress uptick in the last few years. And then the fourth point I'll highlight, and Jason, you probably have a few bright spots before we talk about some of the challenges, but there's been a lot of backlash and talk about ESG investing, not just in the textile, apparel, fashion, footwear industry, but broadly, and backlash towards that. But you also see a lot of bright spots that investors, there's an organization called Climate Action 100, 370 global investors that I looked at today are advocating for brands to be carbon neutral by 2050. Morgan Stanley has data that's showing in 2023, sustainable funds are outperforming their peers. And the market is actually growing in this space, over $3 trillion invested. We are seeing still investments flowing, but we'll talk about some of the challenges too that paint a different picture.
I would add that this, as an industry, there's more activity and more investment than probably any other consumer products vertical. I mean, literally thousands and thousands of sustainability professionals. There's starting to be awareness and engagement on the really hard to reach parts of the supply chain. There's standardized measurement. There's standardized data collection. There's a lot that is happening that is impressive. I think the way, though, and maybe to tee up sort of what's not impressive, it's something that just came out in the last week, was looking at the hype curve, the Gartner market research hype curve, when looking at sustainability. And I think that applies to fashion very well. There's been a huge amount of activity, and I think that's created a huge amount of expectations. And now I think we're up against the reality of how effing hard it is to decarbonize massive global value chains. And that's really disappointing to a lot of people. And the data shows that we've still got a long way to go. However, I think when we talk about, let's talk about sort of where it's failing. I think that this is a good place to think like this is going to be the hard trough where we're going to, in the trough of disillusionment, where we're going to come out of it and actually get to that place where we're going to see the results. But it's going to be painful for a while. And I think the current data shows that we're not where we should be. We're not where we should be in terms of planetary boundaries. We're not where we should be in terms of all the investment that's already happened and all the activities today It's not quite yet bearing fruit, but I think it will turn around. And I think Evan's done some great work on looking at that on a scorecard basis for where companies are, for how they're performing against their science-based targets.
Thanks, Jason. Evan, I know you weren't trying to push off all of the downside of the equation to Jason, so let's hear some of what you've been researching and learning on how we're not yet reaching our goals.
To put it in context, as an industry, the estimates show that we need to cut emissions by at least 40% in absolute terms by 2030. And if we just look at the trajectory of the industry right now, we're on pace to not cut emissions at all and actually increase emissions by 30% by 2030. So while a lot of the enabling conditions are there, the hard, cold facts are that brands and the industry as a whole is not making progress towards actually reducing emissions. And we did some research at McKinsey in the last year showing that the majority of brands need to accelerate their efforts. Great that they're out setting scope 1, 2, and 3 science-based targets, but we found that 70% of brands in the industry need to accelerate their efforts, and 30% will require a major shift in how they look at their growth and their operations in order to come close to achieving their science-based targets. So the reality is a long way to go still.
Evan, you mentioned before that regulation has a strong role to play and that there's some upcoming regulation that might be helpful. Tell us about what role regulation has been playing so far and where you think it's going to do more.
Yeah, and I think both Jason and I will have different perspectives on this. Again, my view on it, working within brands and with brands from the inside out, and Jason outside in across the supply chain. But overall, policy will standardize sustainability practices in a sorely needed way for the industry. And it will also create a level playing field, which is very hard to do because collaboration, we talk a lot about collaboration and it's needed, but a lot of these topics can and should be competitive. And the ways to collaborate in this space are needed, but still limited. So that's where regulations will really play a driving force in setting standards. And there's key areas that they're already starting to do that. So we talked about one or mentioned one, definitely on reporting and disclosure. You have the corporate sustainability reporting disclosure policies that is coming to fruition this year, essentially will require brands that are generating revenue of over $40 million a year to essentially report their sustainability impact just like they do their financial impact. And that's essentially called double materiality, and that's going to have a big impact on medium and large size brands. There's a lot of policy that's coming that will increase supply chain transparency in the US. The New York Fashion Act will really increase the threshold for brands to disclose and have visibility into their supply chains. And then there's further legislation coming, particularly in the EU, like we mentioned a little bit further ahead, on circularity and waste in 2025, on product claims and green claims, really pushing brands to ensure that they can validate the claims that they're making with their products. And then, of course, things around regulation on deforestation, which continues to be a big issue to tackle in the industry. So overall, the reporting requirements, the transparency requirements, and then some targeted legislation on waste, circularity, product, and biodiversity are all moving in the right direction to create a level playing field and higher standards for the industry.
That is just starting. I think the first season for reporting for a CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, those reports have just been filed like within the last few months. Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which actually creates corporate liability for not managing the risks of your value chain. Those are just starting to come online. The first ones have come online in the last 1 to 2 years, and many more will come online in Europe over the next 3 to 4 years. We haven't yet seen the impact in terms of the changes on the ground, though we're starting to. And I think every company that I talk to, I'd be curious if Evan has the same experience, is kind of petrified about how this will impact them. They know that Europe does legislation a little bit differently than we do in the United States. In the United States, you get a complete bill. You pretty much know what the whole thing is going to look like. In Europe, they pass these directives and they build in the ability to essentially modify them and change it and create clear guidance as they go along. That hasn't happened yet. There's going to be a lot of change on the ground. But overall, if you look at the direction of reporting from CSRD, it's enforcing transparency. And if you look at the direction of CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that's essentially forcing companies to bring those externalities into the house and take responsibility for them. These are huge steps in the right direction, but we haven't yet seen the change on the ground happen. I think that they're going to be transformative. And I think everyone that's been watching this space for a long time has hoped that something like this would happen, because I think what we're seeing amongst companies is they've got too many competing pressures. Capitalism is a very strong force. If there is pricing pressure, or if there's competitive pressure, or if there's competitive pressure from, say, new competitors that are terrible for the environment, as we're seeing from some of this ultra fast direct consumer product shipping directly from China from multiple different companies. If once that comes in, it's very difficult to maintain your focus. I think that legislation is really key to actually driving and forcing that change.
My experience working with brands is, yes, they are addressing how to build the infrastructure to be able to meet these regulatory demands and trends that are coming. And we're just at the beginning. I think the more brands can be proactive, engaging with legislators, policymakers to design these policies, will ensure that the policies are designed to have the right intent and are taking the brand perspective in mind, but looking also bringing suppliers to the table. And brands should also be organizing on their own to develop effective lobby that provides a voice for brands and suppliers. So this kind of more proactive engagement, once brands are start to prepare to comply, as Jason mentioned, we're really just at the beginning. I'm encouraging brands. I hope to see more brands take that more proactive approach to shaping the policies that they will all adapt to.
Guys, why is this so hard? You've talked about thousands and thousands of people working on sustainability in the apparel companies, all sorts of different organizations helping, all sorts of regulation having already entered the equation and also being developed. You talked about a really complex global supply chain. What is it that makes achieving environmental targets so elusive for this industry?
I think we're up against the limits of capitalism. People are buying too much stuff and they demand it, and the markets are demanding stuff faster and cheaper and in greater quantities. And the volumes are simply unsustainable. People are buying many more items of clothing than they bought years ago. I think what we're starting to see is, even in companies that have great programs and are doing really, really well in terms of lowering their emissions and in their value chain, buying lower impact materials, better design, more longevity. Even in those companies, their emissions are often going up because they're selling more. And so the forces of capitalism are very strong and are not on our side for growing this space. Additionally, and I think Evan will share more on this, is that the disaggregated value chain, the model that was pioneered by Phil Knight in the 1970s to essentially move production overseas. And in some ways, this model has been going on for 200 years from the colonies, but put in hyperspeed by Nike in the 1970s. That model where you don't know where your material comes from and you don't know your upstream suppliers and their commodity steps every step along the way, it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. When I started in this work, there were probably only 6, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. This was less than maybe 10 years ago. There were only 6 or 7 companies that could tell you where their upstream materials came from. They didn't even have that visibility. That has started to change, but I think it gives you an idea of how messed up and disaggregated this value chain was. And so that even understanding where your impacts were was an incredible challenge. I think we're now just starting to see that. What we are seeing is that even the best companies that are doing a great job are, if they're growing, they're probably having this challenge where no matter how well they're doing, it's hard to outpace the improvements in sustainability with the growth of their business.
I think Jason's exactly right. The truth that 70, 80% of the impact from our industry comes from materials and upstream, that's very hard to trace and to know where even some of those materials are coming from. That's really the core of why this work is hard. In the last few years, I think what I also hear from brands is, because it's been a turbulent time in the fashion industry to deliver on growth and profit targets after COVID, with supply chain shocks, with new entrants, consumer preferences, different retail strategies, so many changes affecting brands in the industry right now. It is hard to often justify, sustainability or otherwise, priorities that have higher capital investments initially and longer payback periods. And that is also just the nature of a lot of the work in this space. So when times are tough, brands are going to prioritize things that keep the lights on and drive incremental improvements to achieving quarterly or annual profit and growth goals. And I think sometimes that's fine, but what I hear from a lot of executives across the industry right now is still very committed to their sustainability targets or whatever their plans were in place. They've had to slow down, reduce resourcing, press pause during these more turbulent or challenging times for a lot of brands in the retail industry.
Jason, you mentioned earlier that you founded a company called Worldly, and it's a technology company that helps companies, apparel companies, with the complexity of supply chain data. Tell us more about the role that Worldly is playing, how it's being used, and the role that you think it can play in the future.
Worldly is essentially kind of the premier destination for sustainability data for the fashion industry and for also some other consumer goods products. And it essentially works by gathering huge amounts of data upstream from factories and also from materials vendors and really throughout the value chain to really understand and manage these impacts. I think probably one of the best examples of how that information is coming together right now is something that I'm sure you've talked about a lot about on this program, which is scope 3 emissions. And how do you look at the upstream impacts? That is exactly the kind of thing that Worldly does for carbon, but also does it for water and for waste and for chemistry, because all of these have the same kind of inherent challenges, which is the impact is unseen. It's from those that you're not directly controlling, but you're influencing, you're shaping, you're creating that demand and creating that impact. And so Worldly does that across a network of tens of thousands of factories, across hundreds of materials. And some of the coolest sort of products that it's coming out with right now allow companies to, if they understand, if they have information about their value chain, if they have basic information about their products, they can get pretty accurate scope 3 in estimates based on what those look like, and gives a really clear picture of what you need to do to change. And I think some of the coolest analysis that I've seen that just came out of Worldly and Cascale, formerly the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, is that a huge percentage, I think it was something like 80% of all of the carbon emissions from factories upstream come from just 1,500 facilities. There are these hot spots where you can do great work to just even put them through simple efficiency programs and see immediate benefit. Or you can look at them as a more longer term project and see significant capital investments that can do things like get them out of coal-fired burners and get to zero liquid discharge facilities that don't create any water or waste coming out of it. So there's a lot that can be done using data to figure out where are your impacts, how big are your impacts, where should you focus, and how do you create change in your value chain.
Thanks, Jason. Well, you've both described a really complex, challenging system and also some conflicting incentives for companies. And ultimately, when we think about fast fashion, we're talking about companies that really have built a business model around selling us more apparel as quickly as they can. It makes one think that perhaps their commitment to sustainability can't ultimately be that real. So I'm curious around the question of corporate intent and corporate commitment. Both of you, having either worked inside or with lots of companies, have real insights to this. Is all their effort and talk about sustainability just a cover for a truly unsustainable business? Is it just greenwashing, or is there a deep commitment to change that should give us some hope for a more sustainable industry in the future?
I do think there has been window dressing, greenwashing, green wishing in this space for a long time, and it continues. I think it is getting better in terms of the industry and brands stepping up to understand their impact, set realistic targets, resource those initiatives appropriately, and then deliver progress reports against their progress or lack thereof. But to Jason's point earlier, there are misaligned incentives in the industry that fight against the more deep-rooted progress and challenges that we're trying to address. And in my personal opinion, there's three things that I think a lot about that we really need to see if we're going to get over this hurdle of kind of incremental progress. And that's one, first and foremost, better financing, access to financing. One of the things I've advocated for is brands to set internal carbon pricing so they have a better way to quantify the impact, but also incentivize their business to prioritize initiatives that reduce their carbon footprint. I think the second being the one that we talked a lot about, the regulatory dynamics and policies that will drive bigger action and impact across the industry that's needed. And then the third is technologies at scale. To Jason's point earlier, because it's a very fragmented supply chain that's been operating without a lot of changes for hundreds of years, the technologies that we're starting to see are great on recycling, on new supply chains, on traceability into the supply chain, but we need to scale them fast. And so we're going to need to support also through financing those technologies and those operational improvements. So those are the three things I think that really just have to happen if we're going to get beyond the incremental progress.
I remain an optimist in general in all of this work. Risman and I both have daughters that actually have known each other a very long time. When I think about the world that they will inherit, I want to believe that we are going to either come close to hitting our targets or exceeding our targets. And I think when you talk to executives, I've spent a lot of time privately with CEOs and senior executives, sourcing executives at these companies. They all believe in their need to essentially line up with climate change goals. And they think that ultimately they will be regulated in a way that they will need to hit it. I think where we are now is it is still tough. Every large company is putting out too much stuff. If you compare a sportswear company to a fast fashion company, their unit volumes are very similar, or the same for a mass market retailer that may also sell food products. These are all entities that are selling billions of products. We know that this is too many, and I think there is going to be some societal change that will drive some of this in terms of probably reduced consumption is going to be necessary. All of the companies right now are experimenting with new business models like take back and resale models that I think they're still not showing evidence today of the kind of progress that we need, but I think it's beginning to retrain consumers and retrain expectations. And we do have amazing innovation. I mean, there are literally thousands of startups in this space that are doing everything from figuring out how to make black pigment out of carbon that's coming out of the air to completely recycling products into new fibers that can be reused over and over again. I mean, there's amazing innovation in this space. And then we also have regulation that's coming fast and hard that I think ultimately coming out of Europe will create accountability to stay within at least planetary carbon targets. I don't think the legislation yet is looking at water or biodiversity targets. I think that will come in the future. So I remain optimistic. I think that we cannot expect, though, goodwill alone to drive the change that we expect. This is the same with throughout the whole world right now. I think everyone's looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, what is going to create this change? And I think if I've learned nothing from my time in the industry, there's no silver bullet. It's not measurement, it's not innovation, it's not regulation, it's not goodwill, it's not educating the consumer. It's all of those things and some things that we don't even know yet. I'm optimistic that we will have this change, but I think we can't sort of make one single bet, and we can't be Pollyanna-ish to think that goodwill or good intention alone is going to create the change that we need.
Let's go deeper into the role of startups. And you mentioned several. We actually had a black pigment company on the podcast previously. Also have met a ton of entrepreneurs doing things related to the circular economy of apparel, trying to keep materials in use. I'd love to hear from both of you. What are some big opportunities that you see for startups or for those investing in startups to make a dent in apparel?
Yeah, I work with a lot of startups across the industry now, up the value chain, down the value chain. I mean, they're all playing very significant roles in driving change and impact. Because we talked about the reality that most of the industry's impact comes from materials, I'm really excited by a lot of the innovations and startups that are working in that space of material innovation. And that goes hand in hand, to your point, Jason, on circularity and recycling, because what we want to start seeing is more material innovations that are taking either post-industrial, so waste from factories, or post-consumer, waste from end of life or consumer, a product that is no longer needed, and then turning that back into new fibers that the industry can use. In some material, it really depends on the materials. Some are further along than others, but we're seeing great strides with startups that are working on both the material innovations and the recycling technology to get closer to a closed loop material system. So it's great progress in natural fibers, some synthetic fibers, polyester, and then progress in cotton too. But those are the startups that I really get excited about and I think that we really need. The other area I'll just quickly mention is I think it's because the industry, from what I've seen, and even how brands operate in it, can be very fragmented and siloed. Startups that are breaking down those silos, that are bridging between different parts of the value chain, those are really critical. And in my experience, those are the ones that have the ability to unlock innovation. So if they're working on both a material innovation and a manufacturing innovation at the same time, or working on manufacturing and finished goods or somewhere down the line to the consumer. Those intersection points to me are the ones that are most ripe and needed for the kinds of transformation that we need, again, because our industry can be very fragmented and siloed. So those are the examples. And of course, the role that startups play is really important because brands can't innovate on their own, and startups can operate more lean and quickly with different sources of funding. And then, of course, they can develop solutions that the entire industry can use.
I'd also add that there's all kinds of cool places where startups are innovating we wouldn't even expect. I was actually just on the phone with a startup that I advised from New Zealand, Usefully, this morning, and they figured out a way how to essentially turn clothing waste into a road product that can replace bitumen and actually have multiple times more carbon reduction than fiber to fiber recycling. And so there's all kinds of cool things that we wouldn't expect. The one thing I hope, especially for reducing carbon, is that we don't get circularity tunnel vision and only look at things that have this dream of circularity and turning things back into the same thing over and over again. I think we need all hands on deck. Anything that can radically reduce carbon at all stages of the value chain, we should be throwing money at, seeing them expand. That is the kind of thing that I hope we don't get so enamored with the phrase of circularity or cradle to cradle that we miss the forest for the trees on some of these massive reductions that you can see in production, in end of use, all kinds of things that I'm really excited about. And I hope the markets continue to foster these startups that are doing really cool things. I think we're just at the beginning. Again, though, I want to give the caveat, it's not a silver bullet. And I think we can't be short-sighted and think that startups and technology alone are going to solve this problem. They're going to have to be new laws. We're going to have to see personal transformation in the way that we consume. That's going to have to be a part of it too.
Let's go there. I'd love to hear about what you see as the role of consumers as well as retail investors. Apparel is something that we all touch physically every single day. What should we all be doing differently to help address this problem?
Even though this is maybe also a little controversial, there's a group out of Berlin, the Hot or Cool Institute, that has been doing some good research, and they crunched the hard numbers that said basically we should only be buying 5 or 6 articles of clothing per year. That's essentially the planetary boundary amount. I try to live that. I'm living here in France right now, where in addition to a dry cleaner, every town has a repair facility. And we need to essentially radically extend the life of our clothing by repairing it. I think consumers, now that I'm not directly in the industry, my advice to consumers is the best thing you could do is don't buy at all and buy as absolutely little as possible. If that's what you want to do, make a real impact, that's what you should do. You're not going to save the world by buying organic or by looking for a certification and buying just as much stuff as you would without thinking about it. I think we really have to look long and hard at ourselves and say, can we get by on radically fewer items?
Jason, what about secondhand? Now that I've got a teenage kid, I'm spending a lot of time in thrift stores. That's okay, right?
I'll give a contrarian position. I think that right now the secondhand markets are completely stuffed with product because unfortunately, I think what's happening is if people see a secondhand product, look at what happened with drink recycling. It gave us permission to buy things that we probably shouldn't have been buying in the first place. A lot of the people that are putting their stuff on ThredUp or bringing it to Goodwill, they're doing it to make room in their closet for new stuff. It's a good thing to do, but don't think of it as a guilt-free purchase because it's inducing the person who donated it or who sold it to buy something else. Because that's what a lot of the behavior looks like it's doing right now. It's that as secondhand increases, it's going hand in hand with just the volume increases in the sales. That's my controversial point of view, which I could say that now that I'm a free agent. I would just say, don't think you're out of jail by just buying secondhand.
I'll add a little bit of perspective on this because I've helped brands develop their circular business models for several years now with varying degrees of success. I don't disagree with what Jason's saying. I will say that there's a few things. One, buying secondhand, it's a lower impact purchase than buying new. 85% lower than buying something new. So if you are going to buy something, buying secondhand is still the best alternative for consumers. So that's the first thing I'll say. From the brand's point of view, testing these new business models, driving new growth from selling services or products that don't require using raw natural resources and energy to produce is a great way for a brand to reduce its footprint, but only if it replaces the production of a linear unit or a linear good. A lot of brands that are dabbling in this space aren't quite there yet in terms of offsetting their linear growth with, for example, selling secondhand. And that I think is that's a requirement if a brand wants to take it seriously in getting into secondhand sales. Ultimately, if brands are offering solutions that they see, like I said in the beginning, I've worked in this space because brands have a tremendous amount of impact and visibility. If they can use that impact and visibility to nudge behavior towards people that might even, for example, not even recycle, but they might see from the brand that they love and they buy from that they're offering secondhand product, I think that drives awareness and consumer change, albeit probably incremental, but it nudges awareness and behavior that I think we need to in a mass scale. One thing I've been thinking about, because the industry is facing so much pressure from regulatory requirements and just economic pressures that have forced brands to scale back some of their efforts or resourcing or even reframe their targets, I want to see more brands that go back to what got me excited to work in this space. And that was truly seeing sustainability as a differentiator, as a driver of competitive advantage, something they actually wanted to compete on, and it became a differentiator for their business. We are seeing kind of the laggards improve, which is great, but we're also seeing some of the ones that were more progressive in their thinking around sustainability kind of regress to the mean because of the resources that it takes now to focus on reporting, compliance, target setting. So I hope in this next few years, we start to see some brands that step up more to take a bolder stance towards what they think they can and should do and to really lead the industry forward.
Guys, help me reconcile something. We've heard from Jason that eventually we'll get there, but we've also heard about an industry that has really misaligned incentives, where we're not even close to cutting back on emissions and actually still growing them. How do you reconcile these things? How do you reconcile this optimism that we'll get there with an industry that in many ways is still moving in the wrong direction?
I think this is a classic example of where legislation helps. The enabling environment is already there. I think the industry just needs that last push to help get it over the edge. Whenever you see the failings of capitalism or markets not working in ways that actually serve the needs of citizens or serve the needs of the planet, that's usually when legislation should come into force and actually helps create change. I think that some of these emerging rules in Europe and in California, we just saw in California, they just passed an extended producer responsibility law. I think these are going to create change. And so I'm optimistic that that is part of the equation that will actually drive change.
I would add to that and to the discussion we were having earlier, the industry as a whole and brands within it, they know what needs to happen. And it really can be boiled down to a few things that most brands are really prioritize and focus on. We talked about better materials or lower impact materials. We talked about decarbonizing manufacturing and the importance of doing so, particularly in tier 2 and 3 where materials are made. And one of the ones that I've been really focused on in helping brands address is just the fact that brands can be wasteful in their forecasting of demand, helping brands to reduce overproduction that sometimes can be 30, 40% season on season over than what they can actually sell. And getting that lower to 20%, 10%, or even less has a significant impact on a brand's overall emissions. And then, of course, tremendous cost savings. So the reality is brands know what needs to be done. And these are some of the biggest levers that we can pull. And of course, we need to accelerate. And I agree with Jason that the legislation will really, really, really help. But at least we can focus on what we know needs to happen. And those are a few.
Evan, Jason, thank you both so much. Great conversation. Great to catch up with you, and wishing you both best of luck.
Thank you so much, Jason. Great to talk to you.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.